Okay, everyone, let's get started. In the beginning of the session, as we go through the slides, we'll keep the line muted, but we'll open it up at the end for questions. So, my name is Julie Smiley. I'm the Director of Product Management for Biopharma for SOA Software. And I've been in the biopharma industry for about 15 years. My background is mostly in database programming and data management, but the last 5 years or so have been focused on metadata management. Today we're going to go through a presentation on why metadata matters and really looking at how we can improve the clinical development lifecycle by making the most of our metadata. So we're going to look at the clinical development lifecycle. What it currently looks like now is a traditional approach that most companies follow. And then we'll look at a new approach to the clinical development lifecycle and a business example of comparing the two, and then finally a solution for implementing an agile clinical development lifecycle. So with a traditional clinical development lifecycle, you basically have a linear lifecycle that goes through the different lifecycle stages of study startup, study conduct, analysis and reporting, and then submission. Obviously there's a lot of detailed steps within those, and the way that each company follows those and the types of processes within those differs, but the general flow is the same for most organizations. This life cycle is clearly defined. Again, it's a very linear life cycle, and each step is carried out before moving on to the next. This generally works well in a highly controlled environment, but it does have its challenges. Because of the linear nature of this life cycle, it can be very slow and rigid, and it's not easy to adapt to change within it. Also, because of many new technologies that have been added over the last couple of decades, there's been a significant increase in the amount and in the complexity of the data. So what this ends up resulting in is people having to constantly keep up with the different skill sets or needing to hire new people to address the different technologies. It also makes it difficult to exchange data. There are no common semantics or definitions around the data. Generally, data is defined very narrowly but is used broadly. An example is, you define the data when you're creating a clinical database specifically for what's needed for data collection, without much thought in the long run about how the data is going to be used downstream all the way through into a submission. Also, it requires a lot of human interpretation generally when you're exchanging data with others. In addition to it being difficult to exchange data, there has been an increased demand for exchanging data, and a lot of this has to do with people going to more outsourcing models, having to register their clinical studies and the results. Also, safety monitoring has been increased over the last few years. And then, of course, there have been a lot of mergers, acquisitions, and partnerships. And then finally, there's been a lot of evolving regulations. Regulations never stay stagnant. There are always changes, and we're all becoming more global. Most of the companies in the industry have become more global, which means when they submit to different countries, they have to abide by the different regulations. So even one study can have to go through different regulatory agencies and comply with different regulations. Of course, anytime there are changes in regulation, that can add have a major impact on the business processes, and it can be very difficult to adapt or comply quickly, again, because of the linear life cycle. So one of the ways that the industry has come up with to address these challenges is with the use of CDISC standards. So CDISC in the late 90s started developing standards for the entire biopharma industry. And they did this with a goal in mind to increase patient safety, improve the data quality, enable more efficient regulatory reviews, and in the end, reduce the time and cost per clinical study. And there was a study done by Gartner and CDISC back in 2009, and the results showed that the earlier you implement the standards within the clinical development lifecycle, the greater potential benefit you'll have. And you can see here the numbers from that study that they had. So if you start as early as study startup by implementing the standards such as the protocol representation model, you can save as much as 4 months or 80% off the study startup time, and for over $4 million. And if you do that in each stage and use the standards throughout, you can save over $15 million as reported in that study. So there is a big opportunity there with the CDISC standards, but with opportunity, of course, there are also challenges. Some of the challenges with these standards are that, again, you have different standards being used globally. We don't have regulatory agencies requiring the use of those standards across the world. So, that's definitely a challenge, especially in studies that are global. The standards development process is also mainly dependent on volunteers. If you look at CDISC in particular and the standards teams that they have, and this is really the case with most standards development organizations, when you have voluntary members, things tend to move a bit slower. There's no automated or central way for developing and governing the standards. And this isn't just for standards organizations. This is also talking about the management of standards internally. There's generally not a common way to manage standards internally, whether it's managing the standards themselves or how they're being used. And then, of course, there's a big impact on business process change to really implement the standards as they come out. And again, that could be internal or external standards, but trying to implement those internally can cause changes to the way you do your business, conduct your business processes. And then finally, again, without having common definitions, it makes it very difficult to exchange data. So the results of these challenges are, of course, that the development and rollout of standards, again, internally or externally, can be very slow. It's inefficient to just layer on top of existing processes new standards. And that's typically what people are doing, and as a result, what happens is most companies end up doing a lot of late-stage duplicate programming efforts. So instead of implementing standards all along, they will try and just submit the data in SDTM, and so they're really not getting any business benefit from it, and they're just duplicating effort. Also, without the common definitions, data is just not well defined, and it can be interpreted in many ways. And this doesn't mean just when you exchange with external partners or regulatory agencies, but this can be the case even across different silos within an organization. Again, using data management or data collection as a example of this, when you're going from data collection to statistical programming, there can be a loss in meaning of what something was intended to mean whenever it was collected versus how it's getting reported. And then finally, the way standards get implemented across the industry can be very inconsistent without these definitions. So what we end up with is, we're layering old process or new technologies and standards on top of old processes, and really we're not getting to, an optimal process in the end. Although we may get some benefit out of doing this, it's certainly not optimal. So now we're going to talk about a new approach to the clinical development lifecycle. Really, to effectively implement standards and new technologies, data about the data or the metadata must be defined. Well, data must be defined more broadly and managed more granularly. And what we mean by that, in terms of a broad definition, what we suggest is that the data be defined by the industry level with semantically interoperable standards, that we bind systems to common robust domain terminologies, and we decrease the need for human intervention and interpretation, and increase the data reusability. So by having common definitions, and it's not to say that you define something like protocol and it means the same everywhere it's used, but it's basically having interoperable semantics, so you can actually tell when it's used in different contexts, when a word or a piece of data is used in a different context, you know what it means in that particular context. And then in terms of granular management of the data, it doesn't mean that it changes how we manage the data itself. It's just that we need to start managing the data about the data as well. So what do we really mean when we say metadata? What is this talking about in the clinical space? So really it's everything from the structure and meaning of the data to how it's going to be used, where it's being stored, what the business rules are about it, even how you transform that data. So if we kind of go back to this linear clinical development lifecycle and look at all of the different standards and processes that apply in these different stages, we can kind of focus on some of these, the CRF development, database structure validation, and we can see just one example of this. And this is just demographics data, and we can see that it's the data collection of the demographics data, and it's based on the CDISC standard. And then we are collecting, this demographics data, and we have some, a listing of 2 rows here. So basically everything that we have highlighted here is information about the data. And so it helps us to better understand that data. And so everything underlined is metadata. And then we go from collecting that data to processing that data for data tabulations and then even for analysis. And so to get from how it's collected in the database to going to our actual tabulations, we have some business rules and transformation logic to get from one place to the other. And so all of that is metadata. And then in the end, what we have is the the demographics data for regulatory submission, and it's based on the SDTM standard. And this is, of course, the data tabulations. And then in the end, we see that we have like birth date, and the birth date is combined, whereas when we were collecting it, it's 3 different fields for the birthday, month, and year. And so even something like this, a simple transformation or derivation, is metadata, how you get from one thing to the next and what it means. So again, everything underlined here is considered metadata. My slide's kind of locking up for a moment there. So to manage this metadata, we need to put a life cycle around it. The metadata itself will go through this life cycle, and it can do it in different ways depending on how you want to manage that. But really you can manage the metadata in terms of granularity all the way down to individual variables, individual items in a code list, but also group them together into higher levels as well. So each thing has a life cycle. Even a value in a code list would have a life cycle of its own. So basically, this metadata life cycle is, starts out with discovery. So when you need to create a new clinical artifact, for example, you would go out and look in your metadata repository, see what already exists, and basically reuse what you can reuse. It should already be defined based on higher level standards. And then you only develop what really needs to be developed after that. So you're reusing as much as possible, only developing new things as you move along throughout the clinical development lifecycle. Once you get through everything that's needed for a particular artifact, then you would approve that metadata. So it would go through some sort of governance workflow to be able to define it, make sure it has the right scope, and then it gets, gets approved eventually. And then there's a release process, and this is basically releasing that metadata for consumption. And you're setting the scope of that metadata whenever you're initially creating it. So that release process is setting it for the scope of whatever it's set for. So that could be that this metadata is intended only to be used by certain systems or only for certain studies, or maybe it's a product level or therapeutic area level standard. So all of those different things are really setting the scope of that metadata so it can be used or consumed later. And then after it's released, basically it can be used, it's consumed by different users and systems, and then it's just a monitoring process of that metadata after that. So, really monitoring has to do with the curation of the metadata. You may want to look at that and make sure that it's still being used, so you can eventually retire it. Also for biopharma companies or CROs, they may want to do monitoring for outside sources and factors such as the CDISC standards, for example, to see if they change, because then that may have an impact on their internal standards and metadata. And then eventually you may want to retire that metadata. But again, this is a life cycle that continues on, and it generally starts with the creation of some sort of artifact. And when I'm talking about an artifact in clinical development, this can be a protocol, CRFs, a clinical database, SDTM data sets. whatever it is throughout that whole clinical development life cycle, it's the different things that you're creating to process data throughout the life cycle. And so really this process sort of revolves around that clinical development life cycle. So now, instead of having a very linear life cycle, by managing that metadata, what it does is it helps us to become more agile. And what we really mean by that is that now, whenever you have changes to things throughout the life cycle, let's say it's a change to a standard, for example, that affects, a study, you automatically know when that happens. And I'll give you an example of this in a moment. But really, it just allows you, by managing this metadata, it allows you to become more agile. And we can learn from what was gleaned from the Agile software development lifecycle. When they implemented Agile in the software development, it really helped them, improve time to market. It helped align better with customer requirements and also saved a lot of money in the end. And we can do those same things. It can really help us in the clinical development lifecycle to become more flexible, manageable, and efficient. So let's look at an example of this and what we mean by this. So here we have just a snippet of the clinical development lifecycle, and this is focused on the EDC development process. So this is really current state, what we typically see with different companies. So we have a CRF designer, data manager, someone in that sort of role, and they are trying to create the CRFs or eCRFs for a particular study. And they generally do this by looking at another study's eCRFs that was done recently and is very similar. They also, of course, read through the whole protocol and then also use the CDISC Standards. Sometimes not all companies are using CDISC yet. But whatever the case, and there might be internal standards that they've developed as well. Whatever the case, it's a very manual review process to go through all these documents, which many are hundreds of pages, and determine exactly what is needed in the CRFs. And so they will create, typically with an eCRF, they're creating some sort of specifications. And then also the same for the edit checks. They go through and create edit check specifications through this manual review and interpretation process. So once those are created, they send those to the EDC database developer, who also manually reviews all these specifications generally, not always. Sometimes there's some automation there. They review these and then they develop the clinical database based on those specifications. For a lot of companies now, that process is outsourced because it is very time consuming. A lot of the EDC systems are proprietary and they don't allow people to actually develop them on their own. So then once the EDC system is developed, it's released, and so that's kind of a general process. Now again, this is a very small piece that we're giving an example of, but you can imagine that this process is fairly the same across the whole clinical development life cycle. So some of the issues with this are, again, that data is defined only for the specific use within the life cycle. So in this case, the data is generally defined for exactly how it needs to be collected. It's generally not designed for how it needs to be managed in a database. It's not designed for how it's going to be used for analysis. It's really generally designed for exactly how it's needed in the clinical in data collection. So it does require a lot of human review and an interpretation. The manual creation of these artifacts is generally unstructured. A lot of these things are not done in systems at all. A lot of times they're being done in PDFs, or they're being done, even the standards themselves coming from CDISC are generally sent out in PDF format or in Word format. And then, there's a lot, because of that, there's a lack of automated reuse of these different artifacts. Again, that goes back to that second point there about a lot of human review and interpretation. And then functional area specific version control processes can be a problem as well. It's hard to know sometimes what's the latest version of something like a protocol document. Because they send it off to data management uses it, but then there may have been more changes, but if they're using different version control, it can be a major issue. And generally version control in the clinical development processes now are at a very high level. So you're versioning an entire document or an entire specification versus versioning or managing down at that metadata level. Of course, there are many different types of tools and content management systems being used throughout the entire process. And overall, this can result in, slow processes that are very error prone because a lot of manual effort. They take a lot of resources, they're expensive, and they're inflexible. And really focusing on that inflexible part of it, the impact of amendments are huge. I'm sure you've all experienced this, but a change to the protocol can be such a huge amount of effort and cost all the way downstream because of that manual effort and it being an inflexible process. So if you think about a protocol amendment to change just a couple different things, you're changing this entire document. It could be several hundred pages, and then that's given to the data manager. And then it's really based on that data manager or someone in a similar role understanding those changes and then knowing that casebook to understand exactly what the impact to that casebook is. And then taking those changes and applying them to the clinical database, and then downstream from there to your analysis data sets, your data tabulations. So that process goes on and can take sometimes even up to months to be able to carry out an amendment. So if we look at this new proposed process, this is really just adding a metadata repository into the mix. So now we still have the same types of artifacts to start with, and this is the same process, the EDC development process. But basically, instead of just having these huge documents to work with, we're breaking those things down into much more granular pieces of metadata, and they get stored and managed in the metadata repository. So now when the CRF designer or data manager is creating those eCRFs or specifications, they're not doing it from just these huge documents. They're taking the metadata from what was actually specified in the protocol, the metadata from the standards, from similar CRFs or other studies, and they can use all of that to design the CRFs. So it's a lot more consistent because they're not just copying and pasting and deciding what to use, but they can actually reuse the exact same definitions, the exact same metadata. So if you're going all the way back to the beginning of the lifecycle process and you're actually managing the metadata around the protocol, I mean, we're talking about being able to define different activities in the time and event schedule, for example. Activities in the study, they're defined in the protocol. If you manage those as metadata, you tie them to your study, basically you can automatically generate your time and event schedule for your casebook. If you have full definitions already about what those different activities look like in terms of metadata, and that can be things like saying this particular test, you always require a result, these are the only valid units of measurement for this particular test. All of that stuff is stored as metadata, and you can literally generate your eCRFs based on that, based on what the study specifications are, taking into your consideration your standards, which can be high-level standards from CDISC and can also be your internal standards. And then if you need to add to it, you can also take metadata that was used in other studies as well. So you're never really reinventing the wheel. You're only creating and focusing that effort on creating things that don't already exist. In the end, you still end up with some sort of specifications, but they're generally generated from the repository or some other tool that's integrated with the repository. It's not being generated in some manual way. Same with the database developer. They are not taking in these paper documents and then having to interpret and then create the database, but instead you can do something like integration with tools. You can also do an ODM export, for example, and use that to automatically generate your EDC system. And because you don't have as much of that human interpretation and intervention, it's a lot more consistent and it's a lot faster and more efficient. So really, the metadata repository, just for this example, would include things. It would have your standards in semantics, so that would be industry-defined semantics, your CDISC protocol of representation standard, your CDISC standard, any internal data collection standard you may have. All of those are types of things that would be stored in the repository. And then also for your study-specific metadata, you would have your protocol structure, your definitions, your time and event schedule, the prior and current study ECRF specifications, and edit check specifications. So then, how this process really differs from what we saw before is that we are explicitly defining the data broadly. So we're not implicitly defining it, and we're not defining it just for the narrow use of what we're using it for at that point, but we're explicitly defining it in the repository. We're showing what the transformation is from one lifecycle stage to another. If there's some sort of derivations that are done, for example, all of those would be captured. You're getting automatic reuse of input artifacts. And so that's just saying that, you know, when you're storing all this information, the metadata, you're able to reuse those things. So instead of just manually interpreting them, you're actually reusing them. So the same lab test and all the information about it can be carried through that whole clinical development lifecycle. The creation of these artifacts is structured and able to be created in a consistent way. And again, that can be through your repository itself. It can be through you know, integration with other systems you may already have. But really, you know, if you think about something like your annotations, CRF annotations is a good example. If you are managing all the metadata about your casebook and you're managing all the metadata about your database, you can generate your database annotations directly on your CRFs. You also have to submit, of course, your SCTM annotations. And again, because you're managing all of your SCTM dataset metadata and, of course, your CRF metadata, you can literally just generate that annotation from your metadata. It also gives you reuse again of the granular metadata. So when you have things like certain variables or data sets or domains of data like demographics, you can reuse those in your data collection, reuse them again in your SCTMs or downstream. So you get a lot of reuse out of the metadata. It's not a copy and paste and make changes and those sorts of things. You can actually reuse that metadata. And then also you can integrate with existing tools to help automate those processes. So in the end, this results in processes, again, that are more efficient. They produce higher quality data. It allows you to refocus or reduce your resources, of course, reduce costs, and it really enables that flexibility in the clinical development lifecycle. So now if we think about an amendment, let's go back to the example we gave a moment ago, and we're looking at changing several things in the protocol. Once those protocol things are changed, if you have a good system with good impact analysis, basically you will know exactly what it affects in your ECRFs, in your edit checks, in your SCTMs, every single thing downstream from there. If you are doing cross-study analysis, the same applies. If you make a change to one study, you know exactly what it impacts in that combined analysis, because all of that metadata is tied together through relationships. So now let's look at a solution for actually implementing this proposed Agile lifecycle. So our product is Semantics Manager, and it's based on our Lifecycle Manager product, which has a mature metadata repository and governance platform, and it's been in production since 2001. It does support standards at multiple levels, so it's not just to manage CDISC standards or not just to manage your own internal study level metadata, but you can manage product level standards, therapeutic level standards, and you can tie all these different things together. Our base library includes all the CDISC terminologies, SCTM 312, C-1.1, Bridge 3.2, and ISO 21090 if you want them. Bridge and ISO, not everyone is using them yet, but if you do want to get to that point of being able to have semantics, that's what CDISC is going with, is Bridge and ISO on that piece of it. Also, it is the technology chosen to power CDISC Share. So we are about to complete the first release of CDISC Share, and so you should hear more on that soon. So really the key things that are addressed by Semantics Manager are the things we talked about already. So being able to create, maintain, govern, and use the standards consistently, being able to get the maximum reuse out of your existing data assets, understanding the impact of changes on other people, processes, and systems. And this is a really, really big one because this is something that generally is just in people's heads right now. You know, if you lose key resources, you know how much you lose there, because there's just so much that, you know, understanding what's happened in a particular study, understanding what the history has been, it's very hard to capture all that. So understanding the impact of changes automatically is a huge, huge benefit. Then being able to use standards to improve overall business processes, and then knowing that when you exchange data with others, it's being interpreted correctly because it's not a manual, a human interpretation. So our system has a strong Metamodel definition framework. The underlying physical model is based on OMG's reusable asset specification. And then layered on top of that is more of a logical model, and it's based on the ISO 11179 standard for metadata registries. And basically the way these two work together is that you know, everything that you manage in the system is called an asset, and how you define those assets, what the types are, is based on 11179. So it's based on an actual meta model for managing metadata. And then each of these different asset types have different information about them. They have identification information, which are just basic properties, things that get captured as you process metadata, like you know, when it was created, when it was last modified, who created it, those sorts of things. It also has classification information, which is more of your configurable types of information you want to capture about those assets. And then you have artifact information, and that's really larger pieces of information, like you can attach files to your metadata. You can have references out to other systems, internal systems, those sorts of things. You can actually store those files with your asset. So looking at an asset within Share, for example, with SDTM, we're actually storing the SDTM IG on the SDTM asset. So that's an example of that. You can also reference out to, you know, existing document management systems if you want to do that. And then you also have relationship information. So every piece of metadata gets related to other pieces of metadata, and that's really where a lot of the benefit comes in the being able to get a lot of reuse out of your metadata. This framework is really flexible. You're able to manage any standard or metadata consistently, but it's also has a lot of strength in being able to enforce the usage of the standards in business policies. So you can add, for example, validations onto that framework, so you can make sure, in cardinality rules, to make sure that the metadata meets certain requirements. And those validations are very similar to edit checks, for example, in data management, where you're validating that metadata as it is being entered. So there's also a governance process definition framework, and this automation engine is layered over that Metamodel infrastructure. It is configurable, as is the Metamodel, and you can configure different types of governance workflows. It's not just one set workflow, and again, that's configurable so it can meet your own process needs, but we do have a set of default configured governance workflows as well. There's a drag and drop palette to be able to do that configuration, and you can have multiple workflows. So if you want certain types of metadata to go through one workflow and other types to go through another, you can set it up that way. It also supports multiple parallel or sequential reviewer steps. So you can have, you know, 2 or 3 people or one team review, and then have it go to another person, then to another person, then to another group. So it's very flexible in the way that you can configure these workflows. And it allows you to batch content together for governance. So you're not just submitting one variable at a time through a governance workflow. That would be very hard for anyone to manage. So you're able to actually batch everything together, for example, for a particular artifact. So if you're working on study CRFs, you would send all the CRF metadata together through governance at once. However, once it gets approved, it's approved for whatever scope it was approved for. So, you know, if you already had protocol metadata that had been approved, you're able to reuse that in your CRFs without having to send that back to another approval. However, that's just based on the default workflow. So if you wanted to reapprove it all, you could do that as well. And you can govern not just the creation of that metadata, but also the consumption of it. So you can put workflows around, and we do have some default workflows around, who's using the metadata when they're using it. And so an example of this would be if you created a set of metadata for a particular therapeutic area, and that's what you set as the scope for it, but then there's a study in another therapeutic area that wants to use that same metadata. It's not saying that you can't do it, but you have to send, that metadata automatically gets sent through a governance review process for it to be used out of scope of what it was set to be used for. So we also have different ways to carry out impact analysis. And again, impact analysis is a huge, huge benefit within the system. So this is just a quick example, and this is using one of our visual impact tools. It's called the Asset Relationship Visualization Tool. And basically, this is just showing, you can pull up any particular piece of metadata, and it will dynamically build out all its relationships. And you can say how many levels to go. I mean, there's lots of control you have over that, but it's completely dynamic. So if you add something, you'll immediately see it there. This is an example of the race code list. You can see that this race code list is used by two different variables. They're both called race, and if we follow that out, they're both within a demographics domain. Follow that further, and you can see that this demographics domain is in CDASH, while this one is in SCTM. So what we can tell from this, if we make a change to this race code list, that both SCTM and CDASH are affected by this. This doesn't seem that big. This is something most people would know if they were trying to make a change. But imagine making a change to one code list, and now you have 30 studies tied to it. Now it's a much bigger deal. You would know automatically, instantly, that basically all these different studies are using this. And the system won't automatically change over to that new thing because that doesn't represent necessarily what you want to do in reality. So what it does is it goes from being impact analysis to taking it to the next step, which is inheritance. So basically all of those owners or stewards of that metadata, all that study metadata, would be notified of that change that affected them, and they would be able to determine whether they want to inherit that new change or stay with the previous version that they were already at. And then finally, we also have repository federation capabilities. And this is something that is a big deal if you, especially with CDISC Share. So an example we have here is the CDISC Share repository. This is going to be, this is in Semantics Manager. So you have the CDISC Standards. So you could federate, if you were to use Semantics Manager as well, you could federate, and we have examples of, Pharma 1 and 2 or A and B here, federating to the CDISC repository. And basically, what it means is you could do anything from having automatic updates come through from when CDISC makes a change. You can run the impact analysis, know exactly what those changes, how they impact your metadata. And it could be that you just go down one level and you see that it impacts your own internal global standards, or you could take it all the way down to the study level, depending on how you're planning to use the standards. A lot of people just take the CDISC standards and then create their own internal and then different levels from those, but it could be even further down. Now keep in mind that CDISC has not made any decisions yet about federation and if they'll let people federate, but it is an example of the capabilities of the system and one big advantage of federation. Another example would be is if your organization had Semantics Manager and you were outsourcing to a CRO. It might be that you actually federate with that CRO installation. So you can basically push your specifications to the CRO, have the CRO do whatever sort of development they do. Maybe it's the database development. If they make any changes or anything, it pushes it back to your library. So it's being able to share metadata both ways, share standards both ways. So that's really what the federation piece is about. So to summarize this, really what the goals here for this session were is to learn really how standards and metadata can be used to save time, effort, and cost in clinical development. And as we saw, we're able to automate the standards development and implementation processes and move towards this proposed Agile clinical development lifecycle. We also want to know how to minimize or maximize the reuse of existing enterprise content. And the key here is to define data more broadly with industry-defined semantics and be able to manage more granularly. And this is a goal of CDISC Share as well, is not to just have standards around the granular metadata for the standards, the existing standards, which is really the variable level metadata, but to also have the semantics behind that. So having common definitions, having common structures for those definitions as well. So again, if you say a certain lab test, you know exactly that these are the things you collect about it. These are the data points you collect about this particular lab test, but even going a step beyond that to say for this data point, like units of measurement, you would specify exactly what the valid units of measurement were for that specific test. So it's really getting down to having standards for variable level or value level metadata, not just that variable level. And then how to effectively manage standards and metadata. Really manage them consistently across the development lifecycle in a controlled metadata repository. Have that repository be the authoritative source. Maintain control over the metadata using governance workflows. And again, those workflows can be, not just on how you create the metadata, but also on how you use it. And then finally, how our product supports this approach is through having strongly typed configurable Metamodel, having the configurable governance workflows, and then of course that really big piece is the impact analysis and inheritance. So we're going to open up the lines now to see if there are any calls, or if you feel more comfortable, you can post questions in the chat window as well. All right, looks like the lines are open now. Are there any questions? When you're asking about how mature the standards are you talking about the CDISC standards in particular? Right. So CDISC standards in particular, and again, our repository does come with some of the CDISC standards. Those have been in place. There are production released standards have been in place for quite a long time, for years. But many of or all of them up to this point have been released, in PDF and Word docs and things like that. So it's very hard to use them programmatically. Every company is basically taking those in, interpreting them themselves, and creating their own sort of way to use them programmatically. I've heard a lot of companies say that they, kind of break them out and type them up into spreadsheets and stuff. So different companies are doing that different ways, which is some of the problem. There's a lot of differentiation in how people interpret things. But, for Share specifically, which again is an implementation of Semantics Manager, we've gone through in very great detail C-1.1, SCTM 312, and all of the CDISC terminologies, and then also Bridge, ISO, and adding a bunch of concepts from EVS as well. We've gone through all those things in great amount of detail to break them down into metadata and to be able to get them into Share. So they will be once it is released, the Share, and they're going to release in export formats to begin with. But once that is released, they'll be a lot more usable programmatically. I see that there's another question online about how they're going to be able to receive standards, how you'll be able to receive standards from Share. This is really a question for CDISC, but it was discussed today in a CDISC Advisory Council meeting, and I got clarification from the team as well. So Initially, it's just going to be through a download site. That download site, I'm not sure of the timing of that yet, so it won't be through Semantics Manager directly in the beginning. So there are different export formats that will be coming out of Share. There's ODM, Define, .xml 1.0 and 2.0, and then there will be an RDF export that's not available yet, and then a tab delimited export format, and all of those will be on the CDISC download site for people to use. Are there other questions? Okay. I'm showing a slide now that has different contact information. So if you would like to set up a presentation or demo specifically for your company, or if you have questions, you can find contact information here for the different regions. There's also different ways to connect with us. So before we close, we do have a few minutes left. I just want to ask one more time if there are any other questions. All right, well, thank you all very much for your time, and let us know if you have any questions or if you'd like a follow-up. Take care, thank you.